This lesson is on solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So the first thing we need to do is discuss the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, the most important thing I want you to note here is that it's negative b plus or minus. We'll see later that that means that we're actually going to have to do the formula twice for each problem in order to incorporate that in. So one thing I want to talk about before we move on is that quadratic equations or expressions are in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So in each equation that you work on, you'll need to make sure that you're identifying a, b, and c with the knowledge that sometimes they're not in the correct order. So let's look at this first equation on the left. 2x squared plus 7x minus 9 equals 0. So I have a because I know that a is with x squared, b is with x to the first power, and c is a constant by itself. So now what I can do is I can plug these numbers into the quadratic equation. Or the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b. Well, my b is positive 7. That negative just means opposite. So negative 7 plus or minus the square root of b, or 7 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. Now I'm going to simplify some of that. So in my calculator, if I do 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 9, I get 121. So I can replace what's inside here with 121. So now I'm going to break this into two different problems because of that plus or minus. So I will have negative 7 plus the square root of 121 over 4 and negative 7 minus the square root of 121 over 4. Well, I know the square root of 121 is just 11. So negative 7 plus 11 is 4. Negative 7 minus 11 is negative 18. So x is going to equal 1 and x is going to equal negative 18 over 4. Now I can simplify that by dividing by 2, which would make it negative 9 over 2. Or I can change that into a decimal, and negative 9 divided by 2 is negative 4.5. You could see that answer either way. And of course, you can plug them back into the original equation. So 2 times 1 squared plus 7 times 1 minus 9 would have to equal 0 for it to work. Well, that's 2 times 1, so 2 plus 7 times 1 is 7, minus 9 equals 0. That's 9 minus 9 equals 0, so that works out. And you could do it with negative 4.5 as well, and it should work out just fine. Now let's look at this other problem. Now this other example, you can see that they're not in the correct order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract negative 7m and 2 from both sides, so that this becomes 4m squared minus 7m minus 2. And now this is a normal quadratic equation where I have a, b, and c. And I can start plugging in. So the opposite, so my b is negative 7. The opposite of that is 7 plus or minus the square root of negative 7 squared minus 4 times negative 2, all over 2 times 4. And I'm going to split that into two different problems. And I'm going to simplify what's inside my radical. And what the inside of that radical gives me is 81. So I'll have 7 plus or minus the square root of 81 over 8. And I'll have 7, oh, I'm sorry. We'll just do plus on this side. And we'll do minus over here. So that becomes 7 plus 9 over 8, or 16 over 8. And this becomes 7 minus 9 over 8, or negative 2 over 8. So x is going to equal 2, and x is also going to equal negative 1/4, or negative 0.25. Now I want you to practice these on your own, and then we'll go over them. Okay, so let's go over this one on the left. The first thing we're going to have to do is get this into regular quadratic form. So I'm going to subtract w and subtract 6. So this becomes 5w squared minus w minus 2 equals 0. So that's the new problem I'm working with. Now we can plug this into the quadratic formula. So we've got we've got an invisible 1 with that w for b and c. So the b is negative 1. The opposite would be positive 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. So now I can break that down into 1 plus the square root of 41 over 10 and 1 minus the square root of 41 over 10. And I can just put this in the calculator. So 1 plus the square root of 41 divided by 10 gives me 0.74. 1 minus the square root of 41 divided by 10 gives me negative 0.54. So these are both the solutions to that problem. Now before we look at the second problem, there's actually a typo. This should be negative 5. So this is already in quadratic standard form, so we're going to have a, b, and c. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So opposite of b would be positive 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So I'm going to split this up in 2 different ways because of that plus or minus. So 3 plus the square root of 49 over 4, and 3 minus the square root of 49 over 4. And I get that 49 because inside the radical, it's 9 minus 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times negative 5 is negative 40. Keep, change, and that becomes 49. So I have 3 plus 7 over 4, 3 minus 7 over 4. So this becomes 10 over 4 and negative 4 over 4. 10 over 4 simplifies into 2.5. Negative 4 over 4 simplifies into negative 1. So those are both of our solutions to that equation.